Typewriter Terror by Barrie Mahoney. The phone rang. It was a colleague in Las Palmas telling me that the police were in the middle of a response to a potential terrorist incident in the city. A suspect package had been placed in front of the door to the garage of the central offices of the National Police on the island. The building was sealed off, traffic was prevented from entering the road, and anti-terrorist officers arrived to assess the potential danger of the package. These officers quickly discovered that this was a false alarm, and since the suspicious package turned out to contain nothing more lethal than an antique typewriter, the panic was over. 2 days later, I found myself browsing in a charity shop that I occasionally visit. I always find it fascinating to browse through old books, records, and maybe find a technological treasure from the past, such as an old radio or ancient camera. This time I spotted a typewriter, an old Olympia sitting proudly on an antique desk. It looked in remarkably good condition, and one that I guess was made in the mid-1960s. This machine brought back a flood of memories of my father bringing his portable typewriter home from work each day and patiently teaching me to type when I was still at primary school. In more recent times, I've been thankful for computers, tablets, and all the other gadgetry that makes life so much simpler. Did I really want to use a typewriter again? Well, later that morning I returned to the shop and asked for a sheet of paper to test the typewriter. Amazingly, all the keys worked. The type was clear and aligned. It felt smooth and accurate to the touch, which was surprising for a 50-year-old machine. It had clearly been well looked after. It came also with a very smart protective case. As I handed over the €10 asking price, I asked the man looking after the shop to tell me more about where it had come from. He told me that it had come to the shop as part of a house clearance following the death of an important man several years ago. The typewriter had been forgotten and only recently been put on display. He wouldn't tell me any more about the original owner of the typewriter and seemed pleased when I stopped asking questions and left. I returned to my car, pleased with my purchase, although it was much heavier than I remembered. I was also intrigued by the response to my questions and felt there was much more to discover. It was when cleaning the machine that I found an old sticker in the case with the name of the shop that had originally supplied it. The sticker included a phone number, which was in a different pattern of numbers currently used. It was not too hard to track down the modern version of the number, and I decided to call it. Although it was doubtful that the shop would still be in business, I remembered that many businesses in the Canary Islands are passed through many generations, and even though the original trade may have changed. To my surprise, the telephone number worked, and a man answered. The man listened patiently to my story about the typewriter and told me that his father had owned the shop but had died some years ago. As well as selling typewriters, his father had also serviced them. Although the current business no longer sold typewriters, the son had kept some records. Did I know the serial number of the machine? Fortunately, I had already predicted that I'd be asked this question and had written it down. The son took a note of the number and promised that he'd call me back mañana. My heart sank when he said this, since mañana is often a polite way of saying never. 2 days later, I received a telephone call. True to his word, the son had checked his father's records and found the serial number of my typewriter, the date of sale and the servicing that it had received. This time the son was quite animated and told me that the machine had belonged to someone important who had died. As I was British, he doubted that I'd appreciate the significance and asked if I'd like to sell the typewriter back to him. He wouldn't tell me who it had belonged to, and I began to imagine that he'd be quoting the words data protection, which is the current way of denying reasonable information requests. I thanked him for his trouble, but declined the offer, as I wanted to keep the typewriter. Even more intriguing is that when I tried to buy a new ribbon for the typewriter, was that when the ribbon arrived from the UK, it would not fit. I contacted the supplier, who assured me that it was the correct ribbon for an Olympia. He was puzzled as to why it would not fit, and asked me to send him photos of the typewriter and the old ribbon spools. His reply was even more puzzling, since it seems that my Olympia typewriter is in fact an Olivetti. He's a typewriter expert and had not come across this issue before, and suggested that labels had been switched at some stage in its life, but could not explain the serial number that related to an Olympia. My imagination began to work overtime. Was it all part of a complicated plot with a switched identity of both its owner and the typewriter? It certainly left me wondering even more about its history and that of its previous owner. I always appreciate a good mystery, and I also now have a rather splendid typewriter that I will use from time to time. I'll always be fascinated by the story behind it, even though I've yet to discover who the important person was, and why the identity of my typewriter was changed. As far as the original news story that started my week is concerned, I'm still wondering why an antique typewriter was left outside the Central Police Office. After all, does anyone use a typewriter nowadays? You have been listening to Typewriter Terror by Barrie Mahoney, which is part of the Letters from the Atlantic series. If you'd like to find out more about me and my books, please go to my website www.barriemahoney.com, and thank you for listening.